I'm going to introduce you. Just like start talking like that. I have to introduce you. So this is my friend Marjorie, who is our state representative. These are my wonderful students, or the ones who are still here, because I had apologized to them already for scheduling the talk, or scheduling it right before everybody left for Thanksgiving vacation. But the virtue of it is that they can all get a more intimate chance to talk to their elected representative.
Yeah, can I ask, guys, if you all could just come down closer? I would love to just closer to you or not up there, empty space here. And that's a lesson for you. You are working in a field, you're talking to people. I know for me, one of the things is that I really talk more, frankly, but I feel like I can engage with people one way, which is about physical practice. It's harder to then like not get complicated. So you can do that too. Just hold your ear.
You guys can come all the way down here. It's the same space. It'll be all right down here. You get even more visibility. And so I've known Marjorie for now about, I think, 25 years, quite a long time like that. Before her very first race for city council in Cambridge, she was one of the youngest people ever elected to the Cambridge City Council, and definitely one of the youngest women. Well, absolutely the most attractive, most intelligent, just like everybody in this room.
Yeah, I know. It's like people were friends. I'm like, did I just say that? I mean, it's true, but you know.
Yeah, everybody's carefully selected here for charm, wit, beauty, all these things. So I've known her for a long time, and she was on the city council for almost a decade, or maybe more than a decade, 14 years. And then ran for the state representative government, which is for the state as opposed to the city. And just downstairs looked up $43 billion for this Commonwealth of Massachusetts budget, which is like essentially set by the legislature, which has 160 people in it, right?
No, 200. 160 members in the House of Representatives and 40 members in the Senate.
Right. So I'm just talking about the House of Representatives, the 160. So 160 people voting on $40-something billion. That's a lot of authority, right? 500 million more. So that's my introduction. She's wonderful. She's a state representative, so has a lot of power. Also a relatively young woman politician, which I asked them if you could talk about some of those experiences too. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. And as Bob said, Bob is a really good friend. We met. I think the story of how we met is a little telling as well for those of you who are thinking about, how do you negotiate, what's in your best interest, not for today, but in the long run. Bob and I met through his dad, who had supported my predecessor and my mentor when I was running the city council. And talked, we chatted, and Bob was very enthusiastic. He just moved back to Cambridge, wanted to get involved. I was like, great, I'll support you. And slides a 20 over to me. And I just put it down and I just split it back. And you have to raise money to do politics. It's a drag, because it's a big part of what we do. He's like, no. I was like, no, really, please, you don't know me. You should get to know me more. And I'm thinking, you're going to be 20 without knowing me. I want to get 500 from you when you get to know me. And so that was the beginning of a very long friendship and relationship. Where we really have worked, not only are we friends, but we've also worked on local campaigns, both local elections, state elections, and national elections. Bob came up and helped bail me out when I was running field for John Kerry's Democratic nominee for President of the United States, and I was in Maine. And we had to, well, even in a national election, it was very interesting to know that our computer system was not working, and we did not have the most up-to-date data. So Bob was up there to bail me out, and here we are using old-fashioned paper and tape and cutting stuff out and trying to create voter lists. I think it's more important to understand for me what I think government's about. And then I'd really like to talk a little bit about where I come from, what motivates me, what are the issues that I've actually wrapped my arms around, why I think it really matters, who's in government and what it reflects. And then if you have questions or areas of interest, I'd love to just respond to that. So I grew up in Cambridge, which Bob and I are a bit of a anomaly. Not a lot of us who grew up in Cambridge actually stay there. A lot of people spread their wings. It's a very international city. So people spread their wings all over the world. And then the other sad part to that is that it's become a very unaffordable place for people to live. I grew up in public housing in Cambridge. That's government subsidized housing. I'm the first in my family to graduate from high school. So I went on to a public university, UMass Amherst, and then years later I went and received my master's at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. For me, the motivation to run was understanding that more people who had the lived experience of poverty needed to be at the table, making decisions, and part of the decision-making process. It's very easy to talk about what poverty is from an academic exercise or even from a political exercise. There are people who I think empathize, and really the core of them is to address poverty and inequality. But without people who have lived experience, you don't actually capture the whole picture. And therefore, you can't possibly make always the best decisions that reflect where resources should go, how policies should be made. I always found it really amusing when I ran for city council. So I come from a non-political family. They were not political. They were really focused on surviving day to day, figuring out where they were getting food to put on the table. And that came from parents who worked. My mom worked more than full time and still didn't make enough as a nurse's aide. And my father was constantly in and out of work because he was traumatized from fighting in Vietnam, and we had at the time not recognized what post-traumatic stress does to people who are in combat. For me to be at the table and realize when people would say, "Oh, I'm just not political," that's great, but I'm not into politics. And that was especially true in my early 20s when I was running. Many of us in our early 20s are just trying to figure out who we are in the world. What do we want to be? What interests us? How do we develop skills? And just still writing that narrative that you think will project you on a path. And what we all find out, sometimes those paths actually change in ways that we couldn't have imagined. And I would say, well, that's great. You don't need to be political, but other people are making decisions for you. So thank you for ceding your point of view, your power, your experience in life to other people. Because quite frankly, whether you pay attention or not to politics, we will decide how much of your paycheck to keep. We will often have an impact on how much of a paycheck you get to have. We will impact how many seconds you have to literally cross the street, right? We get to decide whether or not you get to cross the street without getting a ticket. I mean, government touches every element of your life here, right? So this idea that somehow some people can pay attention to politics and some people don't, right? It doesn't make sense, because the truth is, people in government are supposed to reflect the diversity of who we are in the world, or at least in this country, right? What our political thoughts are, what our priorities are, what our values are. And government works best when there really is a true representation of lived experiences and a diversity of opinions, because then you're coming together and you're debating us. We talk about this budget that we're debating at the state level. We will often talk about the various needs of each of our communities. Now, because I represent Cambridge, which is really, I don't know how much of this you've experienced or observed, but it really is a tale of two cities. You go to Central Square. Has anyone here been to Central Square? I encourage you, Central Square. So this is a really funky area that when we were growing up, this was not here. This was Cambridge, but it was grass and dirt and industrial waste is what existed here. So when I was in the city council, I was part of doing the permitting that allowed these buildings to exist, right? They did not exist. And we also have to think about infrastructure. If we allow all this development, this new neighborhood, which is essentially what you're in, we also have to think about, do we have enough water supplies? Do we have, as the sewage system set up? What does it look like to make sure that we actually get, power over here? So I encourage you to explore the Cambridge neighborhoods that are around you, even though it can feel very disjointed because you are literally in between Charlestown, Boston, which was the West End, and Cambridge. So Central Square is where I grew up, and it had always been known to be a place of just a higher level of poverty. And then we're only 6.2 square miles, Cambridge. So then you travel to the other end of the city, anyone here been to Fresh Pond? Oh, I totally encourage you, but of course it's not easy to get there without public transportation, but you have Uber now, so you can get there. And it's a lovely area where our reservoir is. Both my parents grew up in Cambridge. They grew up less than a mile from here. They grew up in East Cambridge. They had never been to Fresh Pond. There's no good public transportation, and it is an absolutely beautiful, peaceful place to observe nature and on great walks, but they've never been there. And the disparity of the have and the have-nots in Cambridge is always existing. The only thing that's changed is our real estate has gone up, is that solid middle class is probably dissipated, so it's become more of those two. When I go to the State House, my constituents expect me to take care of local needs, but Cambridge is a city that also has a really good base for taxes. We do well. We're a comfortable city that can address a lot of our own needs. So I have the fortunate role of being able to speak to sort of statewide needs. So I take on issues that really are statewide, and it is always fascinating to see my colleagues who come from communities that are very different than Cambridge, don't have the tax base and the revenue of Cambridge, and really need to be far more parochial about assuring that their local needs are being met. Like, we need a new crosslight, and the state needs to help pay for it, or we need a new school, or we need to have a senior center, various things like that. The work that I've been able to focus on has been around common sense gun legislation. I don't know, how many of you are from, who here is originally from the US? Okay, so we have a lot of international students, right? I don't know what your experience is when you think about gun violence here. I do know the statistics are that it's very different here. That high probability of you experiencing gun violence here is much greater than many other countries around the world. So one of the bills that I really championed was called the red flag law. Does anyone know red flag is? You've heard that in the press. So it's called a red flag, or an ERCO, Extreme Risk Protection Order. So I filed a bill based on a college student in Cambridge who came to me and said, I have this idea. And it was based on the fact that his best friend in Oklahoma kept buying a gun. And his friend's parents kept telling the gun store, stop selling him guns. He's going to hurt himself. He's going to kill himself. So the parents would take the guns away. He'd go back down to the gun store. He's in high school. He didn't buy the gun. Well, you can imagine where that story is, right? That young person's no longer with us. In fact, he did keep buying a gun that he eventually used to kill himself. So I filed a bill called the red flag bill. It means that if you own a gun in your home and somebody in your family thinks that you're going to hurt yourself or you're going to hurt someone else, you can go to a judge in the same way we have restraining orders here. And you can say that person needs to be evaluated quickly and decided whether or not they should temporarily, up to a year, have that firearm removed from them. So that was a bill that we worked on, and just to get the sense of sort of how this country functions and what democracy looks like here, people get to weigh in on whether or not that's a good idea. There's a lot of people who say the Second Amendment in our Constitution guarantees people the rights to hold guns. We also have, now deceased former Supreme Court Justice Scalia, who's very conservative, who also was very clear that there's a lot of debate around what kind of guns the Second Amendment allows you to have, and whether or not it was, he actually questions that, in fact, it does not state explicitly you're allowed to have any kind of weapon that you want, whenever you want, right? So that's the big debate here. When I filed the bill and testified, I had 6 days of police detail around my house because the anger and the wrath that people experience, how dare I question their rights to own a gun that could be used to hurt themselves or someone else. So 6 days of police detail at my kids' elementary school, because the threats that were coming in, the videos that were being made, you don't know. You don't know who's behind them until the law enforcement has a chance to really assess that. And that's the pattern, right? So people in government are all constantly making choices about what laws do we actually lean in towards for the greater safety of our state and each other, and how much do you want to actually be bothered with what that actually means you have to experience. The gun lobby is great. They're really good at antagonizing and harassing mostly women who are elected officials. I'll say in this case, that is Bob can tell you, the more you threaten me, the more I'm going to dig in deeper. And the law was passed. So I'll give you an example of that. There are other laws we're debating right now around vaping, smoking. I don't know how, you don't have to raise your hand, but there may be people here who smoke. There may be people here who vape. The governor banned vaping for 4 months based on the RCDCs, where our Center for Disease Control says to the country, based on scientific facts, based on information, based on what we're seeing right now in patterns, that vaping is a direct link to vaping right now that we need to better understand that it's actually killing people like within a year of lung disease, and they're dying. And we had a couple of people in Massachusetts who've already died. And the idea that you would just put an all-out ban, right? This is a really fascinating time in Massachusetts. You're interested in the intersection of civil rights, choice, public health, and a business interest, because you have many small shops that went and opened up vaping shops, specifically catering to various populations. You have convenience stores that rely on those products being sold, and without them, they are afraid that they're going under. And we had to make a decision in the State House. We passed it last week, and we passed it in the House. Senate passed it 2 days ago, and the governor's now, we're waiting for him to sign a bill, that while we're not going to ban vaping forever, what will happen in Massachusetts once he signs it in the next couple of days is that you will never be able to buy flavored vaping any longer in Massachusetts. We also added an additional thing that says you will not be able to buy menthol flavored cigarettes, which went beyond the scope of vaping. So, a lot of people were really angry about that. And then I had a bill that got inserted into this bill that put an excise tax on vaping. Currently, cigarettes are taxed with an excise tax, but vaping was not. And so, really, the debate around this is, when does the public health supersede the rights of individuals? When does the needs of small business owners who built a model and invested on something that was illegal at the time, and put everything into that, what happens when the public policy changes? And in this case, we would say it's changed to reflect what we now know and what is a public health interest. And we had hundreds of small business owners come to the State House. Often, convenience stores are gateways for lots of new immigrants into this country who have friends or families who have them, and so it's really this, also this stabilizing economic pathway for a lot of families who come into our country. And we had to say to them, I was asked by a reporter, what do you have to say to convenience stores? And I've got 3 in my district. What do you say to them when they're telling you they're going to lose everything and they're going to start laying off workers? And it's really one of those just uncomfortable moments, because the humanity involved is to acknowledge that this decision is going to financially impact and maybe devastate some people. And then the other part of that is, but now that we know, we can't allow people to build a business practice on something that we know, A, will kill people, make people sick, and then C, the other part of this, what we know from the nicotine and the tobacco industry is that a large part of the money that we spend on healthcare in this country is on nicotine-related illnesses that we all end up subsidizing people who are really sick. And I say that as someone whose father had lung cancer and eventually died, right? So I think that I'm happy to, I know that I'm not all of you have a lot more time, but those are some of the things that I think where it really matters who's in government, right? It's not something that sort of is for other people. And many of you may decide to stay here or go back home. And I think that whatever is important to you, you want to make sure that the people who get elected know what's important to you. Because we are making decisions, and without you actually weighing in and being in communication and having a dialogue, and it doesn't mean that everything that you want is going to get done, because I have 40,000 constituents who I'm trying to balance the need of who vote for me. And then beyond the 40,000, I'm trying to balance the needs of an entire state of people who I also have an impact on. But I guess I would leave it at that. That's going to be the very short version, since I, as an elected official, am often running late, and you are maybe short on time as well.
So thank you. These people, I'm sure I have lots of questions. Yes, a bunch of people had classes at once, so those are that's fine. Maybe just go around and tell her what country you're from. I know we just did that exercise with our wonderful colleague here, but it's very instructive and interesting to hear who these people are, because it struck me when you said that observation about democracy and being involved. Some people in this room do not have any opportunity to collaborate or communicate with their government at all. So
you can depending on where they're from.
Yeah, I mean, James right there, small town, smallish town in China, right? 5 million, just 5 million people live there. So, sorry, that was the. But anyway, maybe just tell them where you're from.
So hi, I'm from Beijing, China. So I have not a dream, but it's part of plan to go to the DC, to go to the George Washington University, and there is a international relation, known as a college. That one's great.
Yep.
And I know a couple of people from there, so yeah, I just want to do something like this. It's part of the plan of all.
Okay, so Drew.
No problem.
Yeah. I just and I do know something like the small thing about how things work in America, but I don't know they are just fluffy or the part of the truth.
For
Like,
housing?
like the government by influence, government by influence by money or something.
Well, I think that in case that's still fresh, and turn on CNN. And even Fox News a little bit these days is starting to admit that. Yeah, clearly. I mean, I think what's fascinating about this country, I think there's like a wake-up call for Americans right now, because we are raised culturally to believe that like this is the best country in the world to live in. It's the most democratic country, that economically you will do well, that anybody can make it. And like all of those things are true, and they're also not true. And I think this presidency is really, I will be very clear, like I was like never Trump. But you open up that curtain and all of the beautiful, fragile flaws of what it means to be a capitalist society that is a democratic society are right there for it. And we are seeing that, we did not build resiliency, because in my opinion, resiliency for a functioning capitalist country, for a democratic country to be functioning, the best resiliency is that every single person pays attention to who's going into government. Every single person is paying attention. Does this person in government actually represent my needs? Are they the kind of person? Are they, do they have integrity? Do they have the ability to listen? And are they going to create guardrails that ensure when corruption takes place that it'll immediately be addressed, right? We're seeing this in our military right now. I think this is probably one of the more startling places for me, is that, and I'm the daughter of a retired, well, he's passed away, my dad was a veteran. So my whole life was surrounded by military, even in Cambridge, I like to joke. And to see that we have the military courts have held individuals accountable for war crimes, and have the President of the United States to like undo that and position people back into the military that was taken away from them. I'm simplifying this, right? That for me, like even in the midst of everything else that's going around, and it's whiplash to watch American politics and to be an American, right? Just sort of what's happening with our democracy and our president, but to see what's happening in our military, for me, that is the, we always talk about the, what's the canary in the mine, right? And the mine, coal mine, thank you, right in the shaft, right? Is that saying that like, the canaries know first if something's about to happen disastrous, right? And we've had many of those along the way, but to see that our military has been so compromised by the President of the United States is in the most like startling, horrific way. It really is, I think it really is. We are in a historic time right now, I think, as a country, and as a younger country that hasn't been as tested as many of the countries probably that you represent. I'd love to just keep going around quickly.
Yeah, I'm from Turkey.
Yeah, not so different, right? And
yeah.
I think just a longer history, right? It's maybe not as startling if you are from Turkey, because you have thousands of years of trying to like figure out where your country. We are only talking about a couple of hundred years.
I'm from Peru. The history of Peru actually is like way more than probably similar kind of to the United States. Yeah, but we had more time of slavery in my country, 500 years, and then we get our independence. Most of the South American countries also had at the same time. But actually, Peru right now is still figuring out how to develop, because it is still another developed country.
I'm from Venezuela. Everyone knows what's happening.
Yeah.
I was also raised in Argentina. Both of my parents were Venezuelans.
Okay.
I'm from France, and although I think it's one of the best democratic systems in the well, people are still never happy. So yeah, but everything
We
is
just
good.
went to France
I don't
this
have
summer. We
those
liked
kinds
it.
of problems. Everything is good.
So I'm from Germany, and in my experience, I discovered that people outside of Germany are more like they see the German politics as better than Germans themselves. So we're less happy with it, like France. But for example, my host mom in Texas, she was all about Merkel.
Well, I know Markle looks like an amazing hero if you're an American here, and partly it's because she's willing to like she's not putting up with bad behavior from a president. I mean, that's from our president, and that should not be the thing that we measure. But
so in Germany, people are kind of getting sick of her because she's never taking like a real stand. She's always trying to compromise everything, but in some ways you can't just compromise.
yeah, I actually just want to sit up for a point for a second. This whole issue of compromise, I think, you know, again, whether you are in the private sector or you're in government, this issue of where do you compromise? You know, it's when I'm mentoring other people who are coming into politics, and they're like, if you run for office, there's something inherently, but you want to be loved. At least that's what, like, at least American politicians do, right? But it's not just enough to be like believed in. We want to be loved. We want to be liked. And so that can also cloud sort of like where your ability is to make art. But are you making, you know, as a parent, my children don't always like me, but I'm always making decisions that are about their like safety and their health and their well-being. That's my primary. Whether they like those decisions or like me at that moment has to be secondary. And I think that as an elected official, you know, when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, we have a responsibility to take a stand and to make decisions around that and to accept the fallout. I mean, for me, one of the greatest examples of that is I'm missing his name right now. Anyone here from Australia? The Prime Minister from Australia, who was elected from the Conservative Party, and I want to say 20 years ago, but it could have been actually longer, when there was that massive shooting at the mall in Australia, and it was like the largest mass shooting that they'd ever experienced. And immediately, this Prime Minister stepped up, made a choice and a path that he took, knowing it was going to end his career, and it did. So he'd just been elected, and he basically said, we are going to ban all semi-automatic weapons. We're going to not only ban them, we're going to collect them and get them off the streets. And what we know about gun violence, the most effective way to reduce gun violence is to ensure that the kind of guns people have access to, eliminating those access, and that's what flips out the Second Amendment folks here, right? Like, we should have anything we want to. So he made this choice, and it wasn't until a year ago, and then so for 20 years, no mass shootings there, none, right? It works, there's a direct correlation. Massachusetts has the most common sense gun ownership laws in the country that we enacted in 2014 after the massacre of elementary school children in Connecticut. I was just entering the House, and the Speaker of the House took a bold lead to move this. The one piece that was negotiated out, compromise, was the red flag bill that I filed. We just took care of that. We have the least number of gun homicides. So it's not rocket science, but there's a huge, when we voted in 2014, there was the minority leader, who's a Republican in Massachusetts, because Democrats are always the majority party here. He was part of this. He was a gun owner, he was a recreational gun owner, a hunter, but he knew we need to take responsibility. But he was also retiring. And the day of the vote, every Republican walked away from that vote but him. And when we voted on my bill last year, 3/4 of the Republicans joined me. And I guess I think I say that it is often, elected officials want to always find out, is there a middle ground here where everybody will love me? And I will say to people I'm mentoring, it's important to know the difference. Because while you're trying to compromise, what you don't realize is at the end of the day, everyone's going to hate you. Because, and there's sometimes elected officials will say, well, if everyone's mad, we know we did something good. I don't think that's true always. Like, it's not a blanket statement, right? People want to know where you are. I have people who vote for me who don't agree with maybe half the stuff that I do, or my values, but they vote for me because they know I'm always upfront about where I am, and that they can count on that, right? And there's some predictability factors in for a lot of people when they think about who they want in government. So
Hi, so I'm from Venezuela as well, but I've lived there only until I was 8 because of like the political situation. I've always been amazed by American politics because here you actually get to choose. You know what I mean? Like for me, like I was born under like this whole like I don't know like a life without like Chavez and like that type of government being in power. And it's great because my parents used to talk about like how things were before and whatever. Like now it's just like you don't pick a political party, you just go against Chavez or against Maduro, like whoever, like anyone that is not them.
Right.
So I've always been a huge fan of like American politics because I remember these years like the first like Democratic debates and they were like joking, like for example, oh there's like so many people on stage and they're like answer rates like you don't know, like some people like don't know how lucky they are that they have that many people on stage. And like if you see all of them, they're all like so well prepared. You know, like you can go to I don't know, like for example, he put an issue he went like here and it's like he has like the background and stuff, or you go to someone else. And like to me that's crazy because you get to choose, you get to like see and also like you have reading stations in Venezuela, we have like one that is like Marjorie myself. And sometimes they don't even take her seriously, and it's sad because she's actually like a really smart woman. So I don't know. I've always been impressed about politics because that you get to actually like make your own political views instead of just being like whoever against.
Right. So I'll say that I think the flip side to where we are as a country right now is that so my husband is from Lebanon, and he grew up really most of his childhood was occurring in the middle of the war. And they were very well-to-do in Lebanon, and then they lost everything. That was taken by militias and by the economy crashing. And so they literally came to this country for to stay alive. That was like ultimately, his father was one of those people who was trying to stay there during the conflict where everybody else had left, but he was going to live it out because he believed in this country. And then ultimately it was like, wait, my kids need to be alive. So he came here as a teenager. And I think often right now that had that been my husband today, I don't know if he actually could have gotten here. No, actually, he could not have gotten here, right? Where we are in terms of immigration is we have completely denied through our policy to pretend that we are not a country of immigrants, right? The great thing about this country is anybody can become an American, and you really are. That's your identity. You're an American, right? Or in my family, still we say we're Irish Americans because my great-grandparents are from Ireland, right? It is one of the things, but I think what we've also learned is how important muscle memory is in the democratic process. When we stop exercising, not only voting, our voting rates here are atrocious. So we have the right to choose, right? But what we're always grappling with as a country is, are we really, who's choosing? If people aren't voting, if people feel disenfranchised, if people are actually finding it really hard to vote because other people in government are making choices to put up as many obstacles as possible, right? And this is happening all over the country. And it just, I think often as Americans, we think we're so disconnected from that reality that we think happens in other countries, but it doesn't happen here. It absolutely happens here. But it doesn't mean that it's actually, it doesn't mean that it's broken, right? What it means is that we're not flexing our muscle and engaging the citizens. We're not paying attention as much as everybody needs to. When some of us accede our ability to choose to just a few, what we've seen is that the ability for corruption and losing choice, right? Because I'm not quite, the population of voters that did vote on election day did not vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Hillary Clinton. But the Electoral College, which is a whole other sort of story here, voted for his president. And then we also know there's a whole other layer of corruption that actually interfered with our elections, both from internationally and then locally. So, but I think it's always worth remembering that I don't think I have so many criticisms, I always have, of our country, both what we do internationally and here locally, but I also love it because I also know that like the structure for strength is there, but it only works if we're all actually participating.
Hi, so I'm Marjorie, I'm also from Germany, but I have a question because I feel like yeah, we just said like how democratic the US is supposed to be, but for me personally, it's one of the least democratic countries as opposed to the potential that it would have to be. And how, because I mean, obviously you don't only have the disparity between the amount of people that vote for someone and
than what the majority results actually seems to show. But also the way who's eligible to vote, and there's a lot of disparity between some people that if they want to if they move from one state to another, they're not eligible to vote anymore, or until they get their written way of voting, it's very complicated. They get it after they're actually the voting time is over, so they never. And some people just are disadvantaged from the voting system, and someone who went to jail, for example, has different ways of. So, what's your perspective? What do you want to do to actually make it democratic?
I would say two things are true, and they can be contradictory. I think we're a very democratic society. I think that the structure that is in place is one that really does enable a diversity of, when I say a diversity of people, I also mean political points of view. And I think that there's, I think it also has, I'm going to go back to this other idea, that when we choose to renege on our responsibility, the democratic system in this country doesn't work by itself. It's really this very dynamic process that absolutely, as citizens, people who become citizens, I firmly believe we are obliged to participate. So in Australia, if you don't vote, you actually get a fine, right? Here, I'm not even sure, I'm not suggesting that we fine people, but what we're seeing is when people don't like what they see, it means that we are vulnerable. We're very vulnerable. So I'm not sure. I think we as a country, or I can talk as an elected official, even in Massachusetts, we have a whole bunch of bills that are looking at our democracy through how we vote, who can vote, when we can vote. We're always trying to fine-tune how do we strengthen the skeletal system of our democratic process, right? It doesn't mean that it's not, it is very vulnerable. We're seeing what's happening at the national level right now. It's this is batshit crazy for many of us that are not for Bob. Bob is actually a student of history, right? So it has a great memory recall. So Bob actually probably is less sharp than I think me, who how did this happen? And it's not that I don't understand it, right? But I don't know that there's an alternative system right now that I would say, let's drop our system and go here. I do know there's lots of things that I want to look at and continue to look at. Should people be able to register on the same day and vote? Well, in some states you can do that, and in other states that you can. Should people be able to have voting rights at the local election if they are not citizens, but they are here and on students? Students but here who have what is it called, a green card, right? And I often say to people, and I have pushed for that for years as a city councilor, I'd say, as a local person, I would much rather ensure that somebody who is paying taxes, and I would have somebody say, they pay taxes, not citizens, yes, they pay taxes. Somebody who has their kids in public school, this is not the profile of everyone, right? This is how I would help it become more relatable. Somebody who is paying taxes, has their kids in public schools, is using all of our public amenities in the same way that we are. So whether that's park or club sports, right? They're going to be paying attention to, are we doing everything that's in the best interest of our community, because they have something at stake, as opposed to somebody who moves to Cambridge. And I'm not saying taking voting rights away, I'm just trying to make a contrast, but there are plenty of people who move to Cambridge who are citizens who will never use our public schools, our public parks, any kind of amenity that the engagement with government is very minimal, right? And they're just not engaging in the democratic system. So allowing non-citizens who have their thank you. I want people who are paying attention, right? So I think that I will just say is that we are so incredibly flawed, and I think that where we get stuck with is people sometimes the inability to confuse their pride in what they think is America with the ability to also recognize our deep flaws that need to be addressed and constantly fixed. And so when Donald Trump was elected, my son said to me, he's going to want you to go back to your own country, Dad. And my husband was 14 when he came to this country. And it was a great moment of teaching for my son. I said, no, actually he doesn't get to make Dad go back to this country. Dad's a citizen, just like I'm a citizen. I just happen to be a citizen for a couple of generations longer than Dad. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things about this country, is that, there have been pathways. They're the only people who've been able to become citizens, other than indigenous people here, have been these pathways. And so that's my long sort of response to that. I don't know. I'm gonna go here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from China, and actually I want to ask you what's your opinion on what's happening in the do you have any comments?
Yeah, so I will tell you, I'm not fully informed. I'm watching it and reading some of the news. The first thing I think of is heartbreak. And I've talked to different friends of mine who are paying more attention than I am. On the one hand, this idea of being able to protest is really important. So if you're like an American and you're like a lefty or progressive, you're watching France and you're going, oh, Joel, that's awesome. I love the French. They're always out there like just taking charge when their government's not speaking to their needs, right? Talk to people in France who are like, yeah, well, they're not speaking. Those protesters are making it impossible for me to get to work, to feed my family, to be able to carry on with business as usual, right? It's this tension of where in this country, one's right to protest and have the First Amendment, right, is also that area is at the expense of other people's security, whether it's economic security or public security. And so without speaking in more detail about what's happening in Hong Kong, part of what I understand is that some of that tension are the protesting happening at the expense of everyday people in Hong Kong whose livelihoods are also being destroyed, whether because, and, you know, we had protests here in the 90s after there was an acquittal of a police officer and another man. Was it a police officer? Who was the Rodney King?
Yeah.
Right. So had killed a man, and the tension was around race, and Los Angeles exploded. Exploded with protest, right? But what part of that explosion was setting cars on fire, you know, destroying stores from people in certain neighborhoods. There was also an element of racism there too, in terms of the neighborhoods that were being targeted. So I don't know. All I can say is that, like, I have more faith in the people who live in Hong Kong to determine whether or not is this something where this tension of protest is making sense. Are people breaking the law, and is that acceptable when people's livelihoods are being hurt? Or the laws that partly, like, I'll tell you, there's another example where we had somebody chain themselves to a highway in Massachusetts with a bucket of cement. So they brought cement out, and then they like put their arm in, and immediately a legislator filed a bill. It still floats around that made it illegal, like it would be a crime to block the highway from protesting. Or I think about, like, Harvard Square was shut down with bodies one night in protest of police violence against African Americans. And I was with my kids, and they were in the car, and they were all like stressed out, and then we couldn't get to where we need to go. And the conversation I had with my kids was like, you know, sometimes when your government's not paying enough attention to you, disruption is about saying business as usual needs to come to a halt, because where we're not paying attention to the needs of people who genuinely are being hurt, if you're privileged, meaning you're not part of that class of people who are experiencing that harm every day as a direct relation to policies that are enabling harm, right? The rest of us need to be made inconvenienced and uncomfortable if that's what it's going to take for us to start paying attention. And so I don't have a yes, no answer in terms of what they're doing is good or bad. I don't know. I just know that I think that this is a country that should be tolerant of trying to figure out those tensions. So I think we should be making it a crime to stand in a highway and block traffic. I don't. The concern always is, can public safety vehicles get through? Can an ambulance get through, right? Is someone else going to die? And so I think there's partly ways of thinking. You always, the public safety folks and first responders always have to have, like, what's plan B when plan A doesn't work? Because it could be a natural disaster that made plan A not possible, right? But it is constantly this tension that if you are part of a privileged class, of whether their identity or anything, and you can ignore the harm that's being caused, at what point do you start paying attention? And does your life need to be so disrupted, and do you need to feel temporarily some of that pain in order to pay attention? And I think, at least for me, that's one of the things that our society here, there's more bandwidth in different parts of the country here to try to figure that out. And I don't have all the answers.
Maybe one more.
US, but I grew up in Nigeria.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was actually born in the US, but I grew up in Nigeria. So Nigeria is like home views of political legal system is based on the corruption. So if you're in the US, corruption is a definite. So when I came here to America, well, the whole perception back there is that all America is a great place that if you come, you would be this whole big thing. You know, you could meet your national if you work hard enough. And that's how it was. So I'm here with
Yeah, I think, that, again, I think what you're saying represents this tension that is part of who we are, right? So depending on who you are in the world, depending on what your challenges are internally, what your, depending on what you can bring to the table, there is the ability to find a path for you that will provide more security economically and maybe safety-wise than you would if you left your home. The flip side to that is there's also a really strong chance that it won't. So I travel a lot to El Salvador, and we have a sister city in the mountains of El Salvador. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Civil War of the 80s in El Salvador. So I traveled to this community where probably half the village had been massacred in this war. And for a long time, both El Salvador and the US tried to pretend it wasn't actually happening. And so people from the US traveled to El Salvador, people from Cambridge in particular, traveled to El Salvador, started forming human chains, to help repatriate people who had to leave their village after it was torched, to help them go back and rebuild. And with this chain of Americans shielding them, part of that was to call attention, because if you hurt an American, then it was going to be called out in the press, and then we had to acknowledge that that war really existed, right? So this involved people at the congressional level who got involved, and who also, we now have a Congressman Jim McGovern who was involved in this when he was a staffer for a congressman from Massachusetts. And we do this exchange with students where we bring a lot of high school students with us there. And it's a powerful experience because a lot of young people there believe that if they just come to the US, their life is going to be so much better. Now, most of El Salvador, particularly if you live in the city, in San Salvador, right, you can't go to school. If you're a person, if your family is not a part of like the elite wealth there, right, going to school is a risk, right? I met with a child whose fingers were, chopped off. And why? Because they dared to go to school and not join a cartel or a gang, right? So it is, so many people, and this is the stuff around sort of that makes me really angry about sort of our immigration policy, right? People leave their countries not because life is great, most often, right? People often leave their countries because they are willing to risk coming here knowing that they may not thrive, but they may be able to have the chance for their kids to stay alive, which then gives their kids maybe a chance down the road to actually build a different life as opposed to being killed at 12 for going to school, right? So it's just, I think that the ability to have economic mobility in this country is seen as having, there's more opportunities for that than some other sort of comparable countries, right? But it's also a really big chance depending on who you are, what your identity is, right? What your identity is, where you live in the country, what you might be internally struggling with, right? There may not be those resources to help you move through, right? So it's a gamble, but I think it's a gamble that has more ability to pay off. But elected officials like me, we're constantly saying, okay, so what are the obstacles to making sure that people who have the ability to thrive and be successful, how do we remove those obstacles? So I do a lot of work around housing. It's really hard to be born in this country or to move to this country and succeed and go to school if you're hungry in the morning. We just passed a bill 2 days ago. It's called Breakfast Before the Bell. So this will ensure that every child in Massachusetts, regardless of income, and we're doing it universally, so there's no shame and stigma, but that will have breakfast before going to class, right? Because it's really hard to study when you're hungry. Really hard to stabilize your life if you're homeless and you're trying to figure out, how are your kids doing living in a shelter with you, and you're dealing with bed bugs, and you're dealing with lice, and you're dealing with the trauma of being homeless, and then yet you have to do something that requires like 6 hours of public transportation travel to go fill out the paperwork to get your child a voucher to get into daycare, and yet you're still trying to figure out how to not be homeless, how to get a job, and all those things, right? So it's so for me, in the United States, the role of government really here, it's about we have the social contract that I believe was, you know, written into the founding of our country, into the Bill of Rights, into our Constitution, and part of that means that we have this responsibility to each other. We have this responsibility, and other people read this very differently who are in elected office, but for me, it is about a responsibility of recognizing that each of us succeeds not on our own, but with the support of a society, right? Because we have public education, because we have roads that are paved, because we have transportation, because we have laws that require, you know, that if you work certain kind of jobs, that those jobs have to ensure that you're safe, right? Those don't exist everywhere else, and they've been developing over the last couple hundred years here. And so even if you think you don't directly benefit, like I just did this all on my own, I told we have a saying, right? I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. Nobody here does that, right? Because there are all these other things that public monies, our tax monies, went in to invest that you benefited from. It just might not be obvious to you. And a few generations down the road, it might not be obvious at all. And so I think that's part of, like, for me, what it means to be an American that's fighting for the kind of society that is possible for many and still has a lot of obstacles for others. Have a good, good note taker. I wish you all well in your studies here. Is anyone close to finishing their studies here?
They're all just starting.
All just starting, okay. I encourage you to get out and see the rest of Cambridge too. It's a great community. And it's easy to be stuck in a bubble when you're with your new friends and students. And over here, you have to make a choice to go see the rest of the city, because this really is a neighborhood. It's our newest neighborhood. It's only in the last decade that this neighborhood has actually emerged. And so it's because of that highway, it's also, there's such a huge disconnect. And it's easier to go explore some of the more, you know, parts over here in Boston. But Cambridge is a really interesting city in terms of what's happening in the city, who lives in the city. And I just encourage you to get out and just, it gives you a taste when you look at different neighborhoods of Cambridge too, like nice microcosm, I think, of sort of what our state looks like in different ways. And I just spent 2.5 weeks in France, and I will just tell you, we loved it. And I wanted to move to Melbourne and retire, like today. But that was also like a different reality.
Okay, thanks you guys.
Thanks.
Yes.